For over 3 decades, The Simpsons has ruled TV comedy, but with that success came a flood of copycats. Shows that borrowed the dysfunctional family formula, tried to match its satire, and often failed in spectacular fashion. Some lasted only a season, others became cult favorites, and a few are still running today. Let's break down every major show accused of copying The Simpsons, starting with one that even shared its creators. In 1994, two of The Simpsons' most trusted writers, Al Jean and Mike Rice, decided to create a new animated sitcom of their own. That show was The Critic, starring Jon Lovitz as Jay Sherman, a cranky New York film reviewer who seemed to hate almost every movie he saw. It carried the same DNA as The Simpsons: clever satire, smart references, and sharp writing. To give it an extra boost, Fox even arranged a crossover, with Jay Sherman appearing in The Simpsons episode A Star is Burns. But instead of winning over fans, the crossover left many viewers annoyed. Hardcore Simpsons fans didn't like the idea of another show being promoted inside Springfield, and critics felt Jay Sherman simply wasn't as relatable or lovable as Homer or Bart. Still, The Critic had plenty of strengths. Its film parodies were ahead of their time, roasting everything from Jurassic Park to Aladdin. In many ways, it was doing the kind of pop culture parody that Family Guy would later become famous for. But the audience just never grew. The show bounced between ABC and FOX, never finding a stable slot, and ratings quickly dropped. By 1995, after only 23 episodes, The Critic was gone. It wasn't a total failure though. Years later, it gained cult status online, with fans appreciating its dry humor and Jon Lovitz's performance. But in the 90s, it was seen as just another Simpsons clone that couldn't live up to the real thing. And while The Critic faded into cult obscurity, the next so-called copycat would take the formula to outrageous new levels and end up becoming The Simpsons' loudest rival. If there's one show that's been called a Simpsons ripoff more than any other, it's Family Guy. When Seth MacFarlane launched the show in 1999, the comparisons were immediate. Just like The Simpsons, it followed a dysfunctional suburban family: Peter, the lazy dad; Lois, the patient wife; their 3 kids, Meg, Chris, and Stewie, and even a talking pet, Brian the dog. The setup was so close to Springfield that critics accused MacFarlane of tracing over Matt Groening's blueprint. The animation in those early seasons didn't help either. Characters looked stiffer, voices were rougher, and the show's pacing felt eerily similar to The Simpsons. Even Matt Groening himself once called Family Guy a shameless copy. But despite all the criticism, Family Guy had something different. It was faster, louder, and way more outrageous. While The Simpsons often blended heartfelt moments with satire, Family Guy leaned hard into cutaway gags and shock humor. One minute Peter was failing as a parent, the next he was fighting a giant chicken across the city in a scene that lasted several minutes. The absurdity gave Family Guy an identity of its own, and for younger audiences in the early 2000s, it felt edgier and more modern than Homer and Marge's world. But here's the crazy part: after only 3 seasons, Family Guy was canceled. Low ratings almost killed it for good. What saved the show was something unusual at the time: DVD sales. The box sets flew off the shelves, and reruns on Adult Swim pulled in massive ratings. Suddenly, Fox realized they had underestimated the show, and in 2005, Family Guy was revived. Since then, it's become one of the longest-running animated sitcoms of all time, even rivaling The Simpsons. And eventually, the rivalry turned into parody. In 2014, the two worlds collided in the special episode The Simpsons Guy, where Peter and Homer finally met on screen. The episode poked fun at the decades of accusations, even making jokes about which show was copying the other. So while Family Guy may have started as The Simpsons with a dog and a baby, it grew into a cultural juggernaut in its own right, one that proved sometimes the copycat can survive almost as long as the original. But Seth MacFarlane wasn't done there. After Family Guy's revival, he doubled down on the formula with another show that looked suspiciously familiar. After Family Guy proved it could come back from the dead, Seth MacFarlane doubled down. In 2005, he launched American Dad, another animated sitcom about a weird family living in suburbia. At first glance, the comparisons to The Simpsons were impossible to ignore. You had Stan Smith, the over-the-top dad; Francine, the housewife; teenage kids Steve and Haley; and of course, not one but 2 odd pet characters: Roger the alien and Klaus the talking goldfish. It looked like another spin on the same formula, and critics were quick to call it a lazy reskin of both Family Guy and The Simpsons. The suburban setting, the dysfunctional family, and the satirical tone all screamed copycat. But here's where things got interesting. Instead of leaning fully on cutaway gags like Family Guy, American Dad carved out its own niche. The humor was more character-driven, often revolving around Stan's exaggerated patriotism, Roger's constant disguises, and the Smith family's chaotic dynamic. Over time, the show leaned less on Family Guy-style randomness and built running gags, complex plots, and even surprisingly emotional storylines. Some fans argue that at its peak, American Dad was sharper and more consistent than Family Guy. Still, the shadow of The Simpsons hung over it. The suburban family setup was simply too close to Springfield for people not to notice. But instead of flaming out like so many other clones, American Dad did the unthinkable. It stuck around. Moving from FOX to TBS, the series kept growing its own loyal fanbase, proving that even if the blueprint looked familiar, the execution was unique enough to survive. So while many shows that tried to copy The Simpsons were canceled after a single season, American Dad managed to push past the criticism and become one of the few copycats still running today. But not every show had that kind of staying power. The next one tried to stand out by being outrageous, offensive, and shocking. And while it grabbed headlines, it didn't last long. By the mid-2000s, audiences were already calling out new cartoons for being Simpsons copycats. So when Comedy Central launched Drawn Together in 2004, the creators leaned into the chaos. Instead of another suburban family, they pitched the show as the first animated reality series, a parody of the real world, except every character was a twisted version of a famous cartoon archetype. There was a Disney-style princess, a video game hero, a talking pig, and even a Superman knockoff. And yes, the dysfunctional group all lived under one roof, bickering, scheming, and spiraling into absurd adventures. A setup that still felt suspiciously like Springfield turned up to 11. What made Drawn Together stand out wasn't heart or clever satire like The Simpsons. It was shock value. The humor was crude, offensive, and often went for the most extreme gag possible. If The Simpsons pushed the line and Family Guy bulldozed it, Drawn Together lit the line on fire and danced on the ashes. The show quickly gained a cult audience for being unapologetically edgy, but mainstream success never came. Critics slammed it as trying too hard, and after just 3 seasons, Comedy Central pulled the plug. In 2010, the creators released the Drawn Together movie, The Movie, which openly mocked the show's cancellation, but by then, the audience had mostly moved on. Looking back, Drawn Together is remembered more for its shock humor than any meaningful satire. It proved that just cranking up the raunchiness of the Simpsons formula doesn't guarantee long-term success. And while Drawn Together burned out in 3 years, the next so-called clone barely made it through 1 season, even though it had a big-name cast and a unique art style. In 2001, another so-called Simpsons clone arrived, the Oblongs. At first glance, it looked like the same setup, a quirky, dysfunctional family living in a strange version of suburbia. But instead of Springfield's middle-class chaos, the Oblongs took things darker. The show followed the Oblong family who lived in a polluted valley at the bottom of town. The dad, Bob, was a cheerful man despite having no arms or legs. The mom, Pickles, was a chain smoker who had lost her hair. Their kids all had their own bizarre conditions, from conjoined twins to a boy covered in warts. Every character was a walking parody of suburban dysfunction, exaggerated through body horror and dark comedy. If The Simpsons used satire to poke fun at American life, the Oblongs tried to push it into surreal territory. But that approach came at a cost. The weird, grotesque character designs turned some viewers away, and the writing never hit the same balance of humor and heart that kept The Simpsons relatable. Despite having big names attached, including Will Ferrell voicing Bob, the show struggled in the ratings. After just 13 episodes, it was canceled on network TV. Adult Swim later picked up reruns, where the Oblongs developed a small cult following, but by then the damage was done. Today, the show is remembered as one of those short-lived, Simpson-style experiments that tried to ride the wave but couldn't find its own voice. It proved that even with a unique art style and edgy ideas, copying the dysfunctional family formula wasn't enough to survive. And if the Oblongs struggled with only 1 season, the next clone did even worse. It didn't even last 8 episodes. If you thought the Oblongs had a short run, wait until you hear about Alan Gregory. In 2011, FOX hyped it up as the next big animated sitcom. Created by Jonah Hill, the show followed a snobby 7-year-old prodigy named Alan Gregory de Longpre, who believed he was smarter and classier than everyone around him. The concept was meant to mix Simpson-style family comedy with an exaggerated character study of a pretentious child genius. But there was one huge problem. Audiences hated Alan Gregory. He wasn't funny, he wasn't relatable, and most viewers found him flat-out unbearable. Instead of the lovable dysfunction of Homer or Bart, FOX delivered a smug, self-obsessed kid who grated on audiences week after week. The writing didn't help either. Critics slammed the show for trying too hard to be edgy while offering none of the warmth that made The Simpsons work. Ratings plummeted almost immediately, and after just 7 episodes, FOX pulled the plug. Unlike The Critic or The Oblongs, which found cult audiences years later, Alan Gregory simply vanished. It's remembered today mostly as a cautionary tale. Copying The Simpsons setup isn't enough. You need characters people actually want to spend time with. And while Alan Gregory disappeared almost instantly, the next show on our list came from a familiar face in animation. And even that wasn't enough to save it. By 2009, even big-name creators were struggling to find the magic formula that made The Simpsons a hit. That's where The Good Family came in, a short-lived series from Mike Judge, the same mind behind Beavis and Butthead and King of the Hill. The idea was simple. If The Simpsons satirized middle-class America, then The Good Family would poke fun at a different target: ultra-progressive, eco-conscious families. The Goods drove hybrid cars, recycled obsessively, and made every choice based on what they thought was politically correct. On paper, it was a clever twist on the dysfunctional family sitcom, but in practice, it never landed. Viewers didn't connect with the characters, and critics felt the satire was too heavy-handed. Instead of being funny or heartfelt, the show came across as one-note, recycling the same jokes about vegan diets and social activism without much depth. ABC gave it a primetime slot, hoping it would become the next Simpsons for a new generation. Instead, it barely lasted a season. After just 13 episodes, The Good Family was canceled, and unlike Mike Judge's other projects, it never developed a cult following. Today, it's mostly remembered as one of the many family satire shows that tried to capture what The Simpsons perfected, only to collapse under the weight of its own concept. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because we've got plenty more deep dives into animation history coming your way, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next one.